Hello, I'm Annie Davey. I've been telling Bible stories to children for many years, and I've got some lovely ones to tell you from the New Testament in this section here. If you want to know about the background, where I got some of the background detail from, you can look it up on the web on truthortradition.com or www.korky.info, where we've written a book called Jesus, Faith and Fact. So it's all in there somewhere, but there's some interesting things here which you may not know. You may think you do know the stories, but wait and see. So let's see what we've got. Hello, I've got the most amazing story for you today. Another true story, like all the Bible stories, but this one happened much more recently. Now in Bristol, we've got a street called Black Boy Hill. And I wonder if you can think why it might be called Black Boy Hill. Well, many years ago, I'm afraid it was where there was a market for these people here. Can you read that white lettering? It was a market for slaves. And slaves were rounded up in Africa, not only by the white people, but also by some of the tribes in Nigeria. They used to collect people from villages that they had lordship over. And they were loaded into great big ships. And they were brought over to England and to America to be sold as people who would just work for nothing. And it was horrific. And one of the people who was in charge of this trade was this man here. Shall we read it together? John Newton. Now, John Newton ran away to sea when he was 9 because his mum had died and he was all on his own. And it was the only way he could think of earning a living, so he became a ship's boy. And so he grew up on a great big ship like this, learning all about how to run the ship, doing all the errands that the men gave him. It was a pretty rough life. It wasn't much fun being a ship's boy. But eventually he became a captain himself, and he had a beautiful boat, and it was called the Pegasus. After the mythical winged horse. And you can see that it was a long time ago, it was in the 1700s, and he was involved in the slave trade. He became a captain and he was sailing backwards and forwards, and the conditions that the slaves were put in, these lovely people they were chained sometimes by the neck, they were put in layers in the ship, and there was no sanitation, not enough food. It was an absolutely appalling trade. And many, many people died on the way, and they were taken either to England to become servants in households or sent to the West Indies to be sugar plantation people, America for the cotton fields. It was a terrible, terrible business. And one day, John Newton fell ill, and he was very, very ill. He was dying. But the slaves that he'd been looking after on his boat gave him some of their food. They didn't have very much, but they gave him a little bit of their food and some of their milk, their water, and nursed him back to health. And he realised what an appalling business it was that he was involved in. And he remembered that when he'd been a little boy, his mum had told him all about this person here. And he realised that he was very ashamed of the things that he was doing and horrified, and he thought, what would Jesus think of me? But he didn't know how to get away from it, how to stop it. And he remembered that Jesus had loved him so much that he was prepared to die to save him from the wrong things that he'd been thinking and saying and doing. And that Jesus said, was it possible to know him? And when he went home back to his wife one day, he said to her, I don't feel happy about this business I'm in. I don't feel happy about it at all. I'm going to have to stop it. And she agreed with him. She was very, very relieved that he was no longer going to be involved in the slave trade. But it took a while for him to to come to terms with it, until eventually he did turn to Jesus, and he said that he was very sorry for all the nasty things that he'd been doing, and asked Jesus' help to become a better person. And he was absolutely flooded with sense of peace and joy and forgiveness and a lightness of heart. And he began to write hymns. And one of the hymns that he wrote, I'm pretty sure you will have heard, was this one here. You remember that one? I don't know if I've got enough voice to sing you a bit of it, but I'll try. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. It's got several verses, and it's a very great favourite hymn. And it just expressed the wonderful sense of freedom and joy and relief, really, when he decided he was going to leave the slave trade. Now, the thing was that there was a great deal of opposition to stopping slavery in the 1700s. There was one other man who became his friend, whose name was William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce and John Newton would talk to everybody they could think of in Parliament and outside to try and get them to pass a law to stop slavery, to stop slave trade. But of course the rich merchants didn't want to do that because they were making lots of money from the slave trade and from the plantations that they had in America and in the West Indies. So it was very, very difficult. And it took a very long time of publicising things, doing lectures, speaking around the country, trying to get people to understand that this was an evil thing and that these families ought not to be split up and ought not to be enslaved. And then 1 week before John Newton died, William Wilberforce was able to go to him and say, "We've done it, we've done it. The law was passed in Parliament that there should be no more slavery in the UK." And it took a while. It took a while for people to get used to the idea. But if you go to Blaise Castle Estate, the hamlet and the little church there, you'll find that there's a grave there marked Scipio, who was a slave and who had obviously been freed, but who had become a Christian. And he's recorded there. But he was only 18 when he died. It must have been a very hard life for these people. But suddenly, well, not suddenly, it took a long time, but then they were set free. It must have been an amazing feeling, mustn't it? And I'm afraid to say that there are slaves in the world today. Even in the UK, people are brought over from Europe now, not so much Africa, but Europe, and they are enslaved, and it's against the law. And if we find out about it, we can tell the police and try to help them, and they can be helped now. There are organisations, and there's one in Bristol called Unseen, a charity which seeks to help people who have been enslaved and to manage to give them a new life and rescue them from that old way of life. But it all started with John Newton and William Wilberforce back in the early 1800s. I think it's a wonderful story. So thank you for listening, and God bless you.